work has resumed at the 36 East and Gulf Coast ports from Maine to Texas that went on a 3-day strike in early October. But now we have one major sticking point. I'm Vesna Brajkovic with the MDM podcast, and in this episode, we'll hear from NEW CEO Eric Hoplin on the impact of port disruption on distributors, and MDM's Mike Hockett is joining me to discuss what port automation has to do with it all. Mike, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. It's always nice to be on the podcast.
So we're here weeks after union dockworkers and port operators reached a tentative deal, ending the strike just after 3 days, but some underlying issues remain. So Mike, I don't think I have to tell you that the potential of a prolonged port strike on the East and Gulf Coasts was coloring a lot of the business news across the country, and many industries were bracing for disruption. But now the conversation has shifted from wages to one major sticking point.
Definitely, and that is port automation. The union representing dock workers and port operators still really need to iron out the details on that front. The union's leader has been really clear in saying that this is airtight language, that there will be no automation or semi-automation at these ports. And meanwhile, the port operators viewed automation as a necessity for increased efficiency and profits. So it's definitely just a key sticking point that is going to be hard to move.
Yeah, and this current contract was extended to January 15th, 2025, but these talks are still going to continue. So when January comes around, we're going to be hearing about the ports once again in the news, so don't be surprised when that comes along. They still need to negotiate their new 6-year labor contract, so it's not over yet.
Yeah, it seems like you only hear about supply chain and distribution lately when things are at a standstill or something's going very wrong, unfortunately.
Right.
So before we dig in here, Vesna, I think this is a good spot to plug a new reoccurring article series from you on this, in this arena that we're rolling out this week. So do you want to summarize that for our listeners here?
Yes, I would love to. So we just launched the Logistics Liaison series on MDM, which is a monthly briefing on the top supply chain issues in wholesale distribution. So think transportation issues, logistics issues, anything that's in the supply chain that will affect distributors. So we just published the very first one on MDM, which talks all about how the distributors are bracing for a strike, the freight impact of that strike, and what's to come, including, just some lessons learned on supply chain disruption preparedness and some quotes from some distributors who are doing well on that front.
Yeah, and it's easy to think that, the strike only lasted 3 days. It's not going to impact distribution very much, but there were definitely some lasting impacts here. And of course, like we said, this issue is not over. So I think that this new series is going to provide just a great monthly snapshot of what's happening in the logistics and supply chain world that is eventually going to impact distribution in some form or another.
Definitely. So nearly 200 associations representing every corner of the supply chain, and this is distribution, also manufacturing, retailers, farmers. The list goes on. You sent a letter to the White House calling for intervention when this was happening. There was actually 2 letters, one in June, which is far advanced of the strike, but in preparation and preempting those impacts, but then a second right as the strike began in October. So one of those associations that authored that letter, and perhaps one of the more vocal ones during this strike and lead up to the strike, was the National Association of Wholesaler Distributors, or NAW for short. So its CEO, Eric Hoplin, made several appearances on Fox News and was quoted by the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, The Hill, Politico, Roll Call, Washington Times. It was a whole media circuit.
He was busy, yeah.
In the days following the strike, I couldn't let them have all the fun. I had to sit down with Eric, myself, Mr. Hoplin, at the NAW office in Washington, D.C., to get his take on the issue, including what we were talking about earlier, which is port automation. So here's that conversation. Thank you, Eric, for joining us on the MDM podcast.
Good morning, Vesna. How are you?
Good. We're here live at the NAW office. I'm happy to have you.
World headquarters. This is fantastic. My first time being interviewed by the famous Vesna.
Yes, I feel honored.
Yeah. I'm the one who's honored.
So I know you've actually been on Fox News recently.
Yes.
You've had some op-eds come out in the Washington Times and kind of speaking on the impact of the disruptions on the supply chain. So I guess why was it important for you to go on mainstream media to talk about the port strikes?
Well, a couple reasons is, one of the important things that we do at NAW is we represent the entire wholesale distribution industry. So we're their voice. And this was a very important issue to the industry, which we can talk about in detail if you'd like. And so I had to represent the industry and help the country understand and our political leaders and the unions and everybody involved understand, this has more effects than just what the contract negotiations we're discussing. And so that's why it was important for our voice to be in the conversation. The second reason, Vesna, is a lot of this is political, and the president has certain powers that can move the parties together, and so part of what we were trying to do is create some political pressure to get that movement to have some sort of resolution, and you do that openly in the press, but also there was a lot of that happening behind the scenes, and more candid conversations behind the scenes as well, and we got most of the result of what we wanted, although of course we got a political solution ultimately because the can was kicked down the road until
Right.
after the election. If this were an economic solution, we would have probably gotten the whole deal because, as you know, Vesna, for businesses, one of the most important things is predictability. And for our distributors, they don't have predictability because they're going to have to take all the same measures they've been doing the last couple months to prepare for this port strike. They have to continue those because we may have another strike in 3 months.
And I will say it was refreshing to have a distribution voice on mainstream media because you don't often hear that. I mean, we hear retail is a big industry that was impacted. So yeah, that was very refreshing to hear.
Fantastic. And, I only had to get up at 4:30 in the morning a handful of times because, when they want you on the top of the news at 6 a.m., it takes a little while to get there. So.
And us, we're 10:30, so...
This is more my speed. This is more my speed. Thank you, Vesna.
And it's clear, the flow of goods, it's important for the U.S. economy. And I think everyone can agree on that. But I think one sticking point, which is still a sticking point, I think the Wall Street Journal, the logistics report, kind of described it as kind of a thorny question of automation. Yep. So I'll kind of just give a brief, very quick, simple. Union dock workers were against automation and still are very clear about that. Mm-hmm. And you representing NAW and representing the greater wholesale distribution industry, have been pretty vocal that you are not opposed to automation. So I think I would love to get your thoughts. Why do you think distributors should care about this automation issue, which is still on the table in January?
Look, this is important for distributors. This is important for the American economy. This is important for the American people. And so, I understand what the dock workers are saying is, they're afraid that their jobs are going to go away. Yeah. And so you have to have a heart about that and understand where they're coming from. But you also have to think about, the broader economic impact and where we're headed. And I think there's got to be a way that we can probably satisfy a bit on both ends. To the dock workers, if you look at what happened in Rotterdam in the Netherlands when they went to their automation some 30 years ago, is they didn't eliminate a significant number of jobs. And if you look at one of the ports on the West Coast it's fully automated, and what they found they were able to do is they kept the same number of jobs, but it's just a different mix of jobs. People are doing different things, and so there's so the jobs that are there might have to evolve a little bit. We might have to have some new skills and new training and do some new things. But also what happened at this terminal in the Port of Los Angeles is when they moved to fully automation is they doubled the output. And so that's the other part of the equation. It's not just about the jobs. It's what happens for the American economy. It matters to distributors because we source things throughout the supply chain throughout the entire world. Yeah. Many of those come through the ports on the West Coast, East Coast, and on the Gulf Coast. And so how efficiently we're able to unload is really important. And so every additional dollar that we spend at the ports is a dollar that's passed on in the cost of the goods that are flowing through. And so the American people also see that as well. So if we want the economy to continue to be resilient, we want it to continue to be strong, we want it to continue to grow, automation at the ports is really important. And so that's why we think that they can't just let this issue go.
Yeah, and there's, in the logistics world, I mean, this is a conversation we're hearing a lot about, the port automation and trucking too. That's a big topic of conversation. Right. Will it replace me as a truck driver or in the logistics department? So I think it's an issue that we hear in every industry.
But ultimately, if you look throughout history, innovation always wins out. and will win out. The question is when, and the question is how. And
right.
So I think there's a way to do this that accommodates the people who are working hard on our docks, but at the same time that paves the way for much greater efficiency at the ports.
Leading up to the strike, you were talking to a lot of your members who are distributors, large distributors in the industry.
And small.
And small,
yeah.
Sure. And what was your impression of their preparedness for the potential of this strike for a prolonged port disruption?
Well, this is one of the fun things about representing this industry is they were prepared. As I talked to distributors, they were looking several months down the line, and so they were increasing their safety stock, and so they could weather a bit of a disruption. They were rerouting supplies to the West Coast and taking some other measures, and so it's one of the things I'm proud of as I was able to share on many of these television programs is don't fear. The wholesale distribution industry is prepared for disruptions. They're doing the same thing right now with the hurricanes that are battering Florida,
sure.
And in other cases where there's a disruption, is we help to smooth things out. We help prepare for those contingencies, and so our industry was really well prepared. But it also sometimes came down to size in some cases. Most of the larger companies have the warehouse capacity to build that safety stock. They have
right.
the capital to be able to invest in those things. They're not going to sell right away. Many of the smaller distributors that I was talking to said, look, yeah, we wanted to be prepared, but I didn't have that capacity or I didn't have that capital. And so I think if the strike had been going on for more than 3 days, those smaller distributors really would have been feeling the pinch, which is part of the reason we sounded the alarm and said we need to bring this to a fast conclusion.
And NAW, along with several other associations that came out opposed.
230. It's one of the great things is there's so many trade associations that represent all lines of trade throughout the economy.
Right.
We're fortunate we account for about a third of the American economy, so we've got a big voice. But when you stand with 230 other organizations, you're representing the entire American economy, and we were speaking with one voice.
Right, and it was manufacturing, automotive,
retail,
clean energy. It was really across the board.
It was.
Given the contingency plans that distributors may have had in motion, it's not like everything in the supply chain kind of went back to normal as soon as the strike.
It doesn't work like that.
Right. So do you have a sense of the logistical headache that a situation like this can have on distributors, and even for a strike that has lasted just only 3 days? I don't know if only is the right word.
You go back several months, and how many planning meetings were distributors in? They're looking at this and preparing. How many different tactics did they take to be able to prepare for the strike? I talked to one distributor said, just out of an abundance of caution, we rerouted some things at the last minute, and so the ships were off the port of Baltimore and started moving them towards the Panama Canal to the West Coast.
Okay.
Well, so the ports reopened, and if they had stayed in position, possibly would have gotten there good sooner. Now it's trying to float the other side of the world, and so there were a lot of disruptions. I think a lot of people who don't understand how the supply chain works thinks, the strike was 3 days. We'll just flip the switch and everything's going to be back to normal. The reality, there was something like 68 container ships off of American ports that probably going to take still another week or two to clear all of that. And so there is a backlog going to be felt. But thankfully it was only 3 days. But again, Vesta, we're not resting on our laurels because the topics of automation, others we mentioned, are still up in the air. We may be facing this exact same scenario just a couple months from now.
Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us.
You're welcome.
Appreciate
This was fun. Yeah, have me back anytime.
Thank you. So thanks again to Eric Hopland for stopping in on his media tour. Mike, you've been covering business for years, and what are your impressions of how this went down in the media?
Yeah, and first I did think it was great that Eric as NAW CEO was just sought as a voice that these media outlets wanted distribution's perspective on this issue.
Right.
So
it was so
cool
refreshing. It was so refreshing to have that voice in the media, for sure.
Definitely.
Mainstream, anyway.
I mentioned this in the intro, but it's so easy to look at, both sides reaching this tentative deal and thinking, great, it's over, things are back to normal. And while that was certainly a good thing that they reached this agreement after only 3 days of the strike, essentially I see it as only buying both sides more time, basically 3 months to settle the underlying issues here that are the crux of the matter. And again, as we said, it's the bigger of the two that I see here. So that tentative deal, it raised wages by over 60%. I don't think the union workers got quite as much of the 77% raise that they were looking for, but certainly better than the offer that the port operators originally offered. But yeah, with automation, it's just hard here because the union has been so adamantly against it in any capacity. Like they're not saying like, oh, we're okay with 10% automation. They've said again, they don't want it anywhere.
Just that word airtight that they had, we want airtight language for not even semi-automation.
They see it as an existential threat to the union's role in moving goods in and out of these 36 or so ports along the U.S. East and Gulf coasts. And if you go to the news section of the International Longshoremen Association's website, you'll see that it's continued to post anti-automation content since this deal was reached. I saw that on October 10th, they shared this video post from a union member who was at the port of Los Angeles, which is, on the West Coast, at a terminal port where they kind of showed just these automated cranes moving with no workers around. And this worker's talking about how, this pier used to be filled with thousands of workers, and now that it's automated, it's empty. And he summarizes the situation by saying, automation might seem cool, but it's not very cool to the workers. And you can empathize with someone in that situation. Back in 2016, I was able to visit the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands on a press trip, which was really cool.
Oh, cool.
We toured a number of logistics facilities, and at that port, and again, this was 8 years ago, it was highly automated. And to that union member's point, it was almost kind of eerie watching these automated trucks and cranes quietly moving containers around with essentially no humans in sight in the port yard. But again, at the same time, from an efficiency and productivity standpoint, automation has always been the natural evolution in supply chains. We've always made machines and programs that just do things faster and with more volume than we can with human physical labor. The safety aspect here, just besides efficiency, automation is undeniably safer for humans. I saw a stat from the CDC about how this is an older stat, but from 2011 through 2017, fatal injuries that occurred at U.S. terminal ports occurred at a rate of almost 16 per 100,000 workers, and that rate is 5 times that of the U.S. workforce overall. And besides fatalities, there were the rate of non-fatal injuries was almost double the U.S. workforce. There's just so many stats against the anti-automation stance here, so during this whole ordeal, I've seen, the Luddite movement mentioned as a corollary here. And as a refresher, Luddites were British weavers and textile workers back in the early 1810s who were staunchly objecting to the increased use of mechanized looms and knitting frames because of the threat of replacing workers. So definitely a similarity there on that front, with the major difference being that the Luddite protests ended up being these huge, violent protests that involved a lot of destruction of property, and authorities ended up authorizing executions to put a stop to this. So things certainly were nothing like that with this situation. But like I mentioned, we've definitely seen a lot of strong words in this standoff, especially from the ILU's president, Harold Daggett, who I got to say looks and sounds exactly like I would expect a longshoremen's union president to look like in terms of just a gruff, big mustached, no-nonsense type of person. There's just been a lot of name-calling, a lot of accusations right up until when the deal was announced, and some since. So both sides certainly are not friendly, even as they're working on making a long-term deal. I'm definitely hoping that both sides find some sort of happy medium before January 15th. But I just don't see any way that happens without the union conceding to at least some extent of automation. On the operator side, maybe that comes in the form of offering a formal retraining program or investing resources to help displaced workers find a new position that has comparable compensation. So there has to be some negotiation here.
Yeah, think 6 years in the future. And having no automation, no semi-automation, that would put them so far behind in innovation. So I just don't see how they would agree to that. We'll see how it goes. I'm very interested to follow the news.
Yeah. And of course, no matter what happens, it just seems like the costs associated with the new deal that they've even tentatively agreed to are eventually going to be passed to distributors in some capacity. Port operators can't just simply absorb a 61% hike in labor fees. They're going to inevitably pass on at least some of that to logistics providers and freight vessel operators in the form of just higher freight rates. And those, freight operators are going to pass some of those costs on to distributors and manufacturers that are using those services. So, we kind of look at the ports and just some of these supply chain logistics things as being in their own kind of world. But obviously, these are very intertwined with distribution and the costs, especially freight costs, that distributors are going to be expected to pay going forward.
And I think this echoes a lot of the news that we've seen. I mean, we saw these port strikes. The West Coast had port strikes. Yep. We had Canadian rail striking earlier this year. So, I mean, labor negotiations, I think it's an important topic to just keep informed and seeing how that's going to trickle downstream to the distributor.
Yep. And you even just see this, at major manufacturers. I mean, look at Boeing. I think it's their machinists that are on strike right now, and It's causing Boeing to have to cut. I think it was 10% of their staff. It just was announced a couple of weeks ago. There's so much more leverage on the labor side of the equation right here. More and more of these strikes have popped up, and it seems like this ports one is the biggest one that, is of interest to the distribution sector as a whole.
Thanks for joining, Mike.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the MDM podcast. Like what you just heard, find more conversations like this one at mdm.com/podcasts. Don't miss our daily coverage on the distribution industry on mdm.com, and consider becoming a premium subscriber to unlock in-depth analysis of key market trends, such as supply chain issues like this one in our new Logistics Liaison series. Catch you in the next one.